September 18, 1943. Solomon Islands. Lieutenant James Hansen, a Marine pilot from rural Ohio, watched the Japanese Zero pull straight up into a vertical climb and knew exactly what the maneuver was meant to do. It was an invitation to die. The Zero's climb rate was legendary. Light airframe, massive wing area, almost no armor. It could go up like an elevator. The Corsair couldn't follow, not without bleeding energy and handing the fight away. Every Marine pilot in the Pacific had seen this trick in the same way. The Japanese pilot climbed until the American stalled, then dropped like a hawk onto the helpless aircraft below. Game over. Except Hansen didn't pull up. He shoved the stick forward. The F4U Corsair dropped its nose and fell away from the Zero like a stone. The aircraft was nearly 2,000 pounds heavier than the Japanese fighter, and Hansen used that weight the way a hammer uses gravity. Altitude turned into speed. Speed turned into control. The airspeed needle swept past 300, then 350, then 400 miles per hour. The Zero followed, confident, committed, unaware that this was exactly what Hansen wanted. The Marine pulled out hard at 3,000 feet. The Corsair's wings groaned as 8 gs crushed him into the seat. His vision narrowed, edges graying, breath forced out of his lungs despite the G-strain technique he'd practiced until his ribs ached. The Zero tried to follow the pullout. It couldn't. Its lighter structure couldn't take the stress at that speed. The Japanese pilot eased off instinctively, widening his turn just enough. Just enough. Hansen hauled the Corsair into a brutal barrel roll, trading excess speed for position. The bent-wing fighter came around behind the Zero with the precision of a machine tool. Distance closing. 1,100 feet. 1,000. For exactly 1.5 seconds, the Zero filled the gun sight. Hansen squeezed the trigger. 6. 50 caliber Browning machine guns fired simultaneously, bore-sighted to converge at a single point exactly 1,000 feet ahead. Not a spray, not a pattern, a fist. The Zero ceased to exist. There was no fireball, no dramatic spin. One instant it was an airplane. The next it was fragments, aluminum confetti scattered through empty sky. The pilot never ejected. Probably never even saw Hansen. Lieutenant Hansen's hands shook as he released the trigger. It was his third kill in the Corsair. The first that proved the mechanics were right. The Corsair wasn't dangerous because it was fast or tough. It was dangerous because of math. The problem with the Corsair. The F4U Corsair had nearly been rejected before it ever reached combat. The Navy hated it. The long nose blocked forward visibility during carrier landings. The landing gear was stiff, causing the aircraft to bounce violently on deck. The stall was vicious, no warning buffet, just sudden snap rolls that killed pilots who didn't respect it. Training accidents piled up. More Corsairs were lost to landing mishaps than enemy action in the early months. Pilots started calling it the Ensign Eliminator. But Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 124 didn't have a choice. They needed a fighter that could handle Japanese Zeros over the Solomons, and the Corsair was what they were given. 2 weeks. That was all they had. 2 weeks to master a plane that actively tried to kill them. Major William Gizzy, the squadron commander, didn't soften it. "You'll either learn this airplane," he told them, "or it'll bury you." The mechanic who changed the war. Sergeant Paul Novak, a maintenance chief from Detroit, worked 3 nights straight without sleep. Foresighting. Over and over. He built a jig from scrap metal, measuring alignment to the inch. He set every Corsair's guns to converge at exactly 1,000 feet. Not 900. Not 1,100. 1,000. Inside that distance, 6 streams of 50 caliber fire merged into a single lethal column. Outside it, the bullets spread and lost effect. The pilots learned fast. Don't spray. Don't panic. Close the distance. Hold the range. Fire only when the math is right. First blood. On September 14th, 8 Corsairs escorted bombers toward Kahili Airfield. 30 Zeros rose to meet them. The numbers should have meant slaughter. Instead, the Corsairs refused to turn. They dove away when pressed, climbed back with speed, and attacked only when they could force the engagement into the convergence zone. 12 minutes. 6 Zeros destroyed. 4 more damaged. No Corsairs lost. Lieutenant Ray Walsh from Boston saw a Zero cross his nose at 800 feet. He fired for less than 2 seconds. The Zero's wings separated at the root. The Japanese pilot bailed out. staring at Walsh with pure confusion as they passed. How did it die so fast? The Japanese didn't understand yet. They thought the Corsair was just another American brute. Big engine, lots of guns. They hadn't grasped the precision. Geometry at 300 miles per hour. Lieutenant David Moore, a former high school math teacher from Kansas, put words to what they were doing. This isn't dogfighting anymore, he said. It's geometry. He noticed something critical. At altitude, the Corsair handled differently. Thinner air reduced torque effects. The airplane became responsive, predictable. Moore developed what he called the vertical scissors. When chased, he zoom climbed just enough to bait the Zero upward. Then he chopped throttle, dumped flaps, and essentially stopped in the sky. The Zero overshot. Every time, Moore would retract flaps, drop the nose, and get 3 seconds inside the convergence zone. 4 Zeros died that way in 1 week. The tactic spread. The Japanese adapted, attacking in larger formations, slashing instead of turning, but every adjustment forced them into predictable paths. Predictable paths led to math. Math led to death. Bougainville, November 1st, 1943. 18 Corsairs against nearly 70 Japanese aircraft. Major Gizzy's briefing was short. They've got numbers. We've got convergence. Stay in pairs. Trust your guns. The battle lasted 43 minutes. Lieutenant Hansen dove through 3 Zeros, hit 500 miles per hour, blacked out under 8 GS, recovered blind, and came back in to kill another Zero strafing a transport ship. He waited. 1,200 feet. 11. 1,000. 2 seconds. Gone. By the end of the fight, VMF 124 claimed 17 kills. 2 Corsairs lost. 1 pilot dead. 1 pulled from the sea by a destroyer. The Corsair had arrived. And the Japanese had learned something terrifying. Getting close no longer meant winning. The Japanese pilots who survived the early encounters reported something strange. American fighters that didn't maneuver like fighters. Planes that refused to turn, refused to chase, refused to stay in a fight longer than a heartbeat. Aircraft that appeared, killed instantly at close range, and vanished before retaliation was possible. They believed the Americans had developed a new weapon. In a way, they were right. The weapon was mathematics. 6 machine guns, perfectly aligned. A single distance where probability became certainty. A convergence zone that turned air combat into a lethal equation. The toll on the human body. The Corsair could endure the violence. The pilots could not. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Banks, the squadron flight surgeon from Maryland, began noticing the pattern by October. Compression fractures in spines. Ruptured blood vessels in eyes. Hernias caused by repeated high G strain. Men in their early 20s walking like retirees. 8 GS didn't feel dramatic in the moment. It felt like being crushed by an invisible weight. But repeated over weeks, the damage accumulated silently. The mechanic from Detroit saw it first. Pilots climbed out of their aircraft stiff, slow, hands trembling. They slept poorly. Their reflexes dulled. But nobody complained. Complaining meant being grounded. Being grounded meant someone else flew your slot. And that meant someone else might not come back. So they flew anyway. They wore improvised back braces cut from scrap aluminum. They taped ribs. They swallowed aspirin like candy. They learned to live with blurred vision and headaches that never fully went away. The Corsair demanded everything. The Japanese adapt. By December, the Japanese pilots had learned the danger of staying close. They stopped committing to turning fights. Instead, they made slashing attacks, high-speed passes designed to limit exposure to American gunfire. Never linger. Never settle into the kill zone. It worked. Kill rates dropped. Losses dropped too. The war became chess at 400 miles per hour. Lieutenant David Moore adapted again. If they won't stay still, he told the squadron, then we make them predictable. He began using terrain, clouds, and the sun itself as weapons. Leading Zeros toward cloud banks where another Corsair waited unseen, forcing attacks out of the sun so the Japanese pilot entered the convergence zone blind. On December 15th, Moore executed it perfectly. For Corsairs drew 12 Zeros toward a towering cloud wall over New Georgia. The Japanese thought the Americans were retreating. They weren't. As the Zeros burst through the cloud, 3 Corsairs waited on the far side at exactly the right altitude and spacing. For seconds, 3 Zeros vanished. The rest scattered, suddenly unsure where death might be hiding. Fresh blood. January 1944 brought replacement pilots from the States. They were confident, well-trained, unscarred. The first one to see real combat, a 19-year-old from Nebraska named Tom Willis, vomited into his oxygen mask during his first high-G maneuver and nearly suffocated. Nobody laughed. They'd all been there. Willis learned fast. On his third mission, separated from his flight, he found himself facing two Zeros setting up a coordinated attack. Training said dive away. Use speed to escape. Instead, Willis remembered something the Detroit mechanic had told him. The convergence isn't just distance, Novak had said. It's time. At 1,000 feet, the bullets took roughly a third of a second to reach the target. A Zero at 300 miles per hour traveled nearly 150 feet in that time. Willis fired at empty air. A moment later, the Zero flew into the convergence zone. The aircraft split in half behind the cockpit. The second Zero turned away instinctively, presenting its tail at exactly the wrong distance. Willis didn't lead. He didn't hesitate. 1 second. Gone. Willis landed shaking, alive, and older than he'd been an hour earlier. The Ghost. Lieutenant Hansen from Ohio developed a reputation among the Japanese. They called him the Ghost. What they didn't know was that Hansen had learned to use the Corsair's dark sea blue paint and the Pacific itself for camouflage. At 50 feet above the waves, the aircraft disappeared against the water. On January 20th, Hansen attacked a formation of Zeros harassing a convoy. He came in wave-top low, prop wash kicking spray into the air, popped up behind the last Zero, fired 1 second, dropped back down. The Zero exploded. The others assumed anti-aircraft fire. Hansen did it again, and again. 3 kills. No warning. By the time the Japanese realized what was happening, Hansen was already 5 miles away, invisible against the sea. Truck. February brought long-range fighter sweeps toward Truck Lagoon. Fuel margins were razor-thin. Turning fights were death sentences. But the convergence zone didn't require time. 1 pass. 1 kill. Disengage. In 12 minutes, VMF 124 destroyed 14 Japanese aircraft. They lost 1 Corsair to anti-aircraft fire. The pilot, the same Nebraska kid who'd once nearly drowned in his oxygen mask, stayed with his burning aircraft long enough to steer it away from a seaplane base. His last radio call was an apology to his mother for not riding more often. What they had become. By March, VMF 124 rotated back for rest. Rest meant sleeping 12 hours a day and still waking up exhausted. It meant hands that shook when holding coffee. It meant doctors quietly recording injuries they didn't yet understand. They were 25 years old. Their bodies were 70. But they had proven something undeniable. The Corsair, dangerous, unstable, murderous in training, had become the deadliest fighter in the Pacific. Not because it turned better, not because it climbed faster, because at 1,000 feet, 6 guns became 1. In 6 months, VMF 124 destroyed 93 enemy aircraft, lost 12 Corsairs, an exchange ratio no American fighter had ever achieved. The mechanic from Detroit received his orders home in April. Before leaving, he trained 3 replacements in bore sighting. 1,000 feet, he told them. Not 950. Not 1050. Exactly. Because somewhere, boys were counting on that precision to live. More touchdown at 150 miles per hour, far too fast. He used every inch of runway and another 100 yards of jungle before the Corsair finally stopped, nose buried in green, tail tilted skyward. The rescue crew found him sitting on the wing, calmly writing a letter to his wife. Last mission. He'd made it. VMF 124's record would be written in numbers. Enemy aircraft destroyed, Corsairs lost, pilots killed or missing. But the men who lived it remembered only a distance. 1,000 feet. The moment where 6 guns became 1 answer. Where courage mattered less than geometry. Where an enemy aircraft simply ceased to exist. The mechanic from Detroit went home and never spoke about bore sighting again, except in his sleep. The farm boy from Ohio returned to his fields, hunting rabbits instead of fighters. The doctor from Maryland became a surgeon, saving lives instead of counting what high GS destroyed. They all carried the same invisible measure with them, a precise line drawn through memory. The Corsair flew on. New pilots learned the rule as doctrine, not desperation. 6 guns. 1,000 feet. Perfect convergence. Physics never changed, even when the war did. Years later, when the last men were gone and the Pacific had swallowed the wrecks, the truth remained simple and brutal. Victory had been solved with alignment. 6 streams of lead, meeting at exactly the right place for exactly 1 second. Mathematics had won the sky. 1,000 feet.